They told her the position was simple. Teach music to a child who didn't speak. Keep to the East Wing, don't ask questions. The salary would clear her mother's palliative care debt in under a year. The NDA was 41 pages long, and the lawyer who slid it across the table wore cufflinks that probably cost more than Isla Merritt's monthly rent in East Vancouver. She told herself she was just taking a job. She didn't know she was walking into the orbit of Cormac Daly, the man who quietly controlled half the port operations on the West Coast and everything dark that moved through them. She certainly didn't know that 6 weeks later, she would be bleeding across the marble floor of a hotel ballroom downtown, her body curled over a 7-year-old girl who hadn't spoken a single word since the night her mother died. This is the story of how a music therapist from East Van brought an empire to its knees. The interview didn't happen in an office. A black town car picked Isla up in front of her apartment on Commercial Drive at 7 in the morning. The man inside introduced himself as Mr. Moss, and he did not shake her hand. He was somewhere between 50 and ageless, with the kind of stillness that made Isla feel like she was being weighed on a scale she couldn't see. "Your credentials are unusual," Mr. Moss said, not unkindly, scanning a folder on his lap. "A music therapy degree from UBC, 18 months at BC Children's Hospital, then you left." "My mother was diagnosed with ALS," Isla said. "I needed to be home with her." "And now?" "She's in a care facility in Burnaby, the good kind." Isla kept her voice even, "which I can't currently afford." Mr. Moss closed the folder. "The position pays $12,000 a month, direct deposit. You'll live on the property, all expenses covered. You will have no social media presence during your tenure, no outside guests, and no communication with the press, law enforcement, or any third party about Mr. Daly, his associates, or his daughter. Especially his daughter." Isla looked out the tinted window. The Lions Gate Bridge was behind them now, West Vancouver rising ahead in cedar and glass. "What's wrong with her?" "Her name is Sophie. She's 7. Her mother passed away 2 years ago in a car accident on the Sea to Sky. Since then, she hasn't spoken. Not a word. 4 therapists in 14 months. None of them lasted." Mr. Moss finally looked at her directly. "Mr. Daly does not want another therapist. He wants someone who understands that sometimes language finds another door." Isla thought of the eviction notice she'd photographed on her phone that morning. She thought of her mother's hands, which used to play Chopin and now couldn't hold a glass. She picked up the pen. "Where do I sign?" The Daly estate sat on a forested lot in West Van overlooking the inlet, iron gates, a long driveway lined with Douglas firs, men in dark coats near the perimeter who moved with the particular economy of people trained to use their bodies as weapons. Isla told herself they were security. She was technically correct. Mrs. Ingram, the housekeeper, met her at the front door. She was a compact, silver-haired woman who said very little and seemed to know everything. She showed Isla to a suite on the 2nd floor that had its own fireplace and a window seat that looked out over the water. Then she stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary. "The music room is at the end of the east corridor," Mrs. Ingram said. "Sophie goes there sometimes. She sits at the piano but never touches it. It was her mother's. A beat. Mr. Daly hasn't been in that room in 2 years." "When will I meet him?" Isla asked. Mrs. Ingram's expression was unreadable. With luck, not for some time. She met Sophie that afternoon. The child was sitting on the bench in front of the Steinway concert grand, cross-legged, her small back perfectly straight, staring at the keys, as if they might do something dangerous. She was dark-haired and serious-faced and wearing a cardigan 3 sizes too big that Isla suspected had belonged to her mother. Isla didn't introduce herself. She didn't kneel down to eye level, or use the soft sing-song voice she'd seen other adults try with quiet children. She walked to the far corner of the room, sat down on the floor with her back against the wall, and pulled a worn paperback out of her bag. Sophie watched her for a long moment, then she looked back at the piano. 15 minutes passed. Then Sophie got down off the bench, walked over, and sat on the floor 2 feet away from Isla, facing the window. They stayed like that until dinner. The breakthrough didn't come from technique. It came at 11:15 on a Tuesday night, when Isla couldn't sleep and wandered down the east corridor in her socks and found the music room door cracked open and the lamp on. Sophie was sitting at the piano again. Isla stood in the hallway and waited. After a long moment, Sophie's right index finger found middle C. She pressed it once, lightly, and the note bloomed in the dark room like something alive. Isla sat down at the end of the bench. She waited another minute. Then she pressed the C an octave higher. Sophie stared at her hand. Then she pressed her key again. Isla answered. 1 note. Then another. Back and forth in the dark, just 2 notes, like a conversation between people who've learned to be careful with words. By midnight, they were playing a slow, halting version of something that almost resembled a melody. Sophie never looked at Isla directly, but at one point, so brief Isla nearly missed it, the corner of her mouth lifted. She had to be good at her job. She was. But she was also falling in love with this child the way you fall in love with something that breaks your heart a little while it heals. She met Cormac daily at 2 a.m, 3 weeks in, when she came downstairs for water and found the back door open. He was being half-carried by 2 men she didn't recognize. The sleeve of his jacket was soaked through. She smelled blood before she saw it. Sharp and metallic, unmistakable. She stepped back into the shadow of the stairwell, but the old floorboard under her heel gave her away. Every head turned. Weapons appeared in the dark like they'd always been there waiting. "Don't." His voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice that assumed it would be obeyed. "She's the music woman. Stand down." The guns went away, but the men stayed tense. He limped toward her with his hand pressed hard against his side, and Isla stood very still and looked at him properly for the first time. He was tall, with dark eyes that were alert despite everything, and a jaw set so tight she could see the muscle working under the skin. He was, she thought, exactly the kind of person her mother would have told her to stay away from. He was also clearly not going to make it to a hospital. "You didn't see this," he said. His voice was even, almost conversational. "You came down for water. You went back to bed." "You need the wound packed," Isla said. He blinked. It might have been the first time in years someone had answered him that directly. "Excuse me. The pressure you're applying is wrong for the angle of entry. You're going to lose more blood than you need to." She held his gaze. "I did 2 years of emergency music therapy at Children's. I've seen trauma. Do you have a kit?" A silence. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. Cormac Daly studied her for a long moment with those dark, careful eyes. "Quinn, get the kit." She helped him. She didn't ask questions. When it was done and he was sitting in the kitchen chair looking less like he was about to pass out, he said, "You're not what I expected." "I'm just doing my job," Isla said, washing her hands at the sink. "Your job is piano lessons." "I know." She dried her hands and looked at him. "Go to bed, Mr. Daly. You've lost enough blood." He almost smiled, almost. After that, things shifted in ways she couldn't entirely name. He started appearing at the edge of the music room, standing in the doorway for a few minutes before she noticed him. He never came in. He just watched Sophie at the piano with an expression that Isla could only describe as hunger, the particular hunger of someone who has punished themselves by staying away from the thing they love most. One night at dinner, he'd started eating with them every few days, sitting at the head of a table built for 12, while Sophie and Isla occupied one end. Isla put down her fork and said, "There's a recital. One of the music therapy programs at the community center in Dundarav. Small thing. 6 children. Sophie was invited to play." Cormac looked up from his phone. "She'd only have to play 30 seconds, Isla continued. "One piece. We've been working on it. It's Debussy. Her mother liked Debussy." The name of his late wife hung in the air between them. Quinn, standing near the window, went very still. "That's not possible," Cormac said, "the exposure. She needs to feel like a child for one afternoon," Isla said quietly. "Not an asset to be secured. Not a variable in someone else's risk assessment. She's your daughter. She needs her father in the 3rd row looking at her like she's the most important thing in that room." The silence was very long. Quinn stared at the wall. "It's a 30-minute event," Isla pressed. "Private venue. You can sweep it 6 times if you want. But if you don't come, she'll know, and she'll carry it." Cormac set down his phone. The community center was small and warm, and smelled like lemon polish and old carpet. Cormac arrived in a dark grey coat with Quinn and 2 other men who tried very hard to look like ordinary parents and failed completely. He sat in the 3rd row. He didn't check his phone once. When Sophie walked out, she found him immediately. She was wearing a navy dress that Mrs. Ingram had pressed that morning, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked so much like her mother that Cormac made a sound, very quiet, that Isla felt more than heard from where she stood at the side of the room. Sophie sat at the small upright piano. She placed her hands on the keys. She played. It was 34 seconds of Debussy's Clair de Lune, and it was not perfect, but it was alive, every note intentional, every phrase something she had carried inside her for 2 years and finally found a way to put somewhere outside herself. When she finished, Cormac Daly stood up. He wasn't clapping. He was just standing in the 3rd row of a community center in West Vancouver, with tears running quietly down his face, looking at his daughter like she had just handed him back something he'd thought was gone forever. Sophie saw him. She did something better. She nodded at him the same way you nod at someone when words aren't enough, and both people know it. Isla looked away to give them that moment. When she looked back, Cormac was watching her. She felt it before she saw it, that shift, the realization landing in his eyes that something had changed between them, and he hadn't noticed when it started. She should have been more careful. She wasn't. The gala was a fundraiser for the Port Authority's youth program, public, necessary, unavoidable. Quinn had swept the venue twice. Cormac attended 3 of these a year. It was supposed to be controlled. Isla came because Sophie had been invited to play a short piece as part of the evening program, and Sophie had looked at Isla with those dark, serious eyes and taken her hand. She was standing in the wings when she saw it. A man near the service entrance who wasn't moving right, too still, watching the wrong direction, his hand inside his jacket, in the particular way of someone waiting for a signal. She had grown up in East Van. She knew what waiting looked like. She was already moving when the first shot cracked through the room. The screaming started. The lights went strange, somebody cutting the main bank. Isla had Sophie by the wrist and was pulling her toward the stage stairs, away from the exit that was now compromised, when a second figure cut off their path. Dark jacket, something in his hand. Cormac was across the room, firing, drawing fire, doing what he did, standing in the path of it so no one else had to. But there was a third man, behind her. She turned and saw the gun leveled not at her but past her, at Sophie, at the small dark-haired girl in the navy dress who was frozen at the bottom of the stairs. Isla didn't think. She moved the way you move when thinking would be too slow. She stepped in front of Sophie and wrapped herself around the child, putting her back to the shooter, covering as much of that small body as she could with her own. The shot was like being hit by something that didn't believe in her. She felt herself go down. She heard Sophie scream, a real sound, a human sound, the first sound the child had made in 2 years, and it was the last thing Isla registered before the floor came up to meet her. She drifted in and out in the car. She heard his voice, steady and low, telling her to stay with him. She felt his hands, which she had watched do terrible things, pressing against the wound in her side with a gentleness that didn't match everything she knew about him. She heard him say her name, just her name, twice, like it was the only word he had left. She was stable, the doctor said eventually. The bullet had broken 2 ribs and nicked her spleen. She was young and strong and very lucky. Cormac did not go home to change his clothes. He went somewhere she didn't ask about, and he came back 3 hours later, with his sleeves rolled up and something resolved in his face that hadn't been there before. He sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand, which was cold, and said nothing for a long time. She was unconscious when Bridger Crane walked in. Bridger had been with Cormac for 11 years. He was the kind of man who knew where all the bodies were buried because he had helped with the paperwork on half of them. He came in quietly, at 3 in the morning, with flowers and a syringe that he had not purchased at any pharmacy Isla would recognize. He stood at the foot of her bed, and he said, very softly, so that only she could hear if she were awake, "You changed him. That's the problem. He used to be manageable." He tapped the air bubbles from the syringe. "I've got an offer from the Port Authority's Eastern partners that requires a version of Cormac who isn't distracted by school recitals. You understand, it's not personal." He reached for the IV port. "It's very personal," said a voice from the bathroom doorway. Bridger went completely still. Cormac stepped out of the dark. He looked the way he'd looked the night Isla had helped him in the kitchen, controlled, unhurried, and underneath that, something vast and cold and very close to the surface. "How long?" Bridger said. "Long enough." Cormac walked forward slowly. Quinn found the second burner, the one with the texts to the Eastern contact, the one where you described Sophie as manageable collateral. The syringe clattered on the floor. Bridger lunged for the side table where a gun sat beside a vase of grocery store carnations. A gun Cormac had placed there himself, chamber empty, firing pin removed. Bridger grabbed it, pointed it, pulled the trigger twice. Click. "I've known you for 11 years, Cormac said very quietly. "Did you really think I'd leave you a loaded weapon?" He didn't raise his voice once. Quinn came in through the door, and Bridger went out of the room, and Isla heard his footsteps fading down the corridor until they were gone. Then there was only the sound of the monitor, steady and green, and Cormac sitting back down in the chair beside her. She opened her eyes. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Enough." Her voice was hoarse, the whole thing about being a distraction. His jaw tightened. "You're not a distraction." She studied his face in the low light. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "She screamed," Isla said, "when I went down." Sophie screamed. Something moved through his expression that was too complicated to name. "She hasn't stopped talking since," he said. "Mrs. Ingram is handling it. She keeps asking if you're going to come home." The word home landed somewhere tender. What happens now? Isla asked. He was quiet for a moment. When you're healed, I can set you up anywhere you want. Halifax, Montreal, overseas, your mother's care, covered for life. You never have to see any of this again. He looked at their joined hands. Or you stay, but I won't dress it up. Staying means this life. It means the walls and the gates and the men at the perimeter. It means I will protect you with everything I have, and I will keep nothing from you, and it will still never be entirely safe. Isla looked at the window. The Vancouver skyline was grey and beginning to lighten, that particular coastal dawn that looks like the sky is remembering itself. What would Sophie say? She asked. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She's been saying your name every 20 minutes since last night. Apparently she also has opinions about your discharge date and whether the hospital food is adequate for recovery. Isla closed her eyes briefly. She thought about her apartment on Commercial Drive, which she'd barely been in for 6 weeks. She thought about the silence in it, before all of this. She thought about a small girl in a too-big cardigan pressing middle C in the dark, waiting to see if anyone would answer. I don't want Halifax, she said. He went very still. I want the piano room, she continued, and Mrs. Ingram's terrible Earl Grey, and Sophie's next concert, whatever it is, wherever it is. She looked at him, and I want you to stop making decisions about what I can handle. We agreed on that. We didn't agree on anything, he said. You were unconscious. Then we're agreeing now. He brought her hand up and held it against his mouth for a moment, not quite a kiss, something quieter than that. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back. 7 months later, the gates of the Daly estate were strung with string lights for the first time since Cormac's wife had done it the Christmas before she died. The ceremony was small. 40 people, the ones who had bled for the family or worked alongside it without compromise. The garden faced the inlet, and the late October light on the water turned everything amber. Isla stood in the master bedroom in a dress that Mrs. Ingram had helped her choose, and the scar along her ribs was hidden beneath ivory silk, and Sophie was standing on the bed in her flower girl dress pronouncing opinions on Isla's hair with the authority of someone who had been silent for 2 years and intended to make up for lost time. Down, Sophie said, be down. Mama always wore hers down. Isla looked at her in the mirror. Down it is. Mrs. Ingram appeared in the doorway, her expression arranged in its usual composure, though her eyes were bright. He's been pissing the garden for 20 minutes, she said. Quinn had to take his phone away. Isla smiled. Tell him I'm coming. She walked down the stairs and through the back hall and out into the October afternoon, and when she stepped onto the flagstone path and looked toward the arch of white cedar branches at the end of the garden, she saw Cormac turn. She saw the moment he found her in the crowd, and what it did to his face. That careful, controlled expression he wore everywhere simply falling away, like something he'd been holding too long finally set down. He wasn't a changed man. He was the same man he had always been, with all the weight that came with it. But he was also a man who now knew every word to the Debussy piece his daughter played, who had learned to make one specific kind of tea because Isla preferred it in the mornings, who had not missed a single thing that mattered in 7 months. She reached the altar and took his hands, which were warm and solid and already familiar. You came, he said quietly, like a man who had gotten used to things leaving. She looked up at him. I always answer back. The light changed on the water below the garden, and Sophie threw a handful of rose petals with tremendous enthusiasm and no particular accuracy, and somewhere in the back row, Mrs. Ingram allowed herself a small private smile. The vows were brief. They had already spoken them in a hotel ballroom and a hospital room and a music corridor at 11:15 at night, in the dark, one note at a time. The words here were almost beside the point. When the ceremony ended and they turned together to face the people they had chosen to keep close, Isla felt Sophie take her hand on one side and Cormac's fingers tighten on the other. She stood between them in the amber light and thought, this is what it means to survive something. Not the absence of danger, but this, the weight of 2 hands, and the decision, every single day, to stay.